For 40 years, no one in Meridian, Pennsylvania had walked through the gate at the top of Thornwood Hill. Not the mayor, not the historical society, not the developers who had made 3 separate offers on the land in the 1990s and been turned away each time by a court order that had no expiration date printed on it, only the name of a dead woman and the year she had decided from beyond the grave when the world would be ready. The court order expired on a Tuesday in September 2025. By Thursday morning, Augusta Calder had the access authorization in her coat pocket and the original key, a brass skeleton key the size of her hand, in her right fist, and she was standing at the front door of Thornwood Manor for the first time in the 22 years she had lived in Meridian. She was 72 years old. She had spent 28 years as a county court judge and 7 years trying to remember what she did before she was a county court judge, and she had been chosen for this particular task for a reason that would have struck most people as administrative and struck her as something else entirely. She did not carry the name of any founding family. She was not Harkness or Drummond or Whitfield or Thorne. She had moved to Meridian at 40 and had no ancestral stake in what it remembered about itself. That apparently was the qualification Celia Thorne had been waiting for. The lock turned with the sound of something that had been holding on for a very long time finally letting go. Inside, the house smelled of cold stone and old paper and the particular stillness of air that has not moved in decades. Gussie stood in the entrance hall and swept her flashlight across the room. A crystal chandelier above her, its pendants webbed over with dust so thick the glass no longer caught the light. A staircase of black walnut rising to the left, its banister worn smooth at the height where a hand would rest. On the wall above the landing, a portrait in oil, the varnish cracked in a pattern like dried mud. The subject a man of perhaps 60, with the expression of someone who had spent a long time being painted and was deciding how much of himself to allow into the image. She recognized the face from the Historical Society photographs. Augustus Thorne, founder of the Thorne and Merrick Coal Company, builder of Thornwood Manor, builder of Meridian itself, in the sense that the word builder sometimes means the man whose money made the thing exist and whose name went on everything afterward. She stood in the hall for a moment looking up at him, and then she moved on. She spent 3 hours working through the ground floor cataloging as she went the dining room with its table still set for a dinner that was never eaten, the sitting room with its sheet-covered chairs, the kitchen with its copper pots gone green. The Historical Society had given her a form with numbered categories, and she filled it in methodically, the way she had always worked one thing at a time in order, without deciding what mattered before she knew what there was. The library was at the back of the house, a long room that smelled more strongly of paper than anywhere else, its shelves still full, the books undisturbed in their places, as if waiting for someone to come back and continue reading. The desk was at the far end, a massive partner's desk of dark mahogany, its surface clear, except for a glass inkwell gone dry, and a brass lamp with a green shade. Gussie walked the perimeter of the room first, as she always had when entering a space she needed to understand. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, and on the 4th wall behind the desk a panel of wood wainscoting that ran from the chair rail to the floor. She almost did not notice it. She had been a judge for 28 years, which meant she had spent 28 years listening to people tell stories and noticing the places where the story did not quite hold together, the small inconsistency, the detail that was almost right, but not entirely the seam where something had been joined that was not originally one piece. The wainscoting on the 4th wall had a seam like that. A vertical line barely visible running floor to chair rail at a point that did not correspond to any structural logic she could identify. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set down her clipboard and stepped behind the desk and put her knuckles against the panel. The sound that came back was not the sound of wood against plaster and lathe. She said it quietly to the empty room. There is a space behind this. She worked at the panel with the flat blade of her penknife until the edge came free, and behind the wainscoting she found what she found. Not a steel safe, a cavity in the brick 18 inches square, sealed with mortar that had been applied with care and painted over to match the surrounding wall, invisible, unless you were looking for the seam and knew what a seam that was hiding something felt like. She chipped at the mortar with the small hammer she had brought for the stonework assessment, and the pieces came away in sections dry and clean after more than a century, and she put her flashlight into the opening and looked inside. A ledger bound in dark leather, its spine intact. A bundle of letters tied with a silk ribbon that had once been blue and was now the color of old ice, and a large envelope cream stock, gone ivory with age sealed and addressed in a woman's handwriting, small and precise and entirely steady for someone who had been 18 years old when she wrote it. This is the truth my grandfather never had the courage to speak. If you are reading this, the time has come. Celia Thorne, 1920. Gussie held the envelope for a moment without opening it. She had read thousands of documents in her career, testimony, evidence, depositions, confessions written and spoken and implied. She knew what a document felt like when it contained something that could not be put back once it was out. She had learned to hold that moment for just a second before breaking it open, not from reluctance, but from respect for the weight of what was about to happen. Then she set it carefully with the ledger and the letters, and she looked at the wall where the cavity had been sealed, and she thought about a woman who had been 18 years old when she put these things here, and who had then lived for 65 more years in this house alone, called eccentric and difficult and worse, by a town that had no idea what she was guarding. 65 years of knowing what was in this wall, 65 years of waiting for the moment when it would be safe enough to let it out. Whatever Celia Thorne had found in her grandfather's desk drawer in 1920, it had been dangerous enough that she had spent her entire adult life making sure it survived until someone could do something with it. Gussie picked up the ledger and opened it to the first page. The wall in the library. The letter from the Pennsylvania Historical Society arrived on a Wednesday, which was the day Gussie usually drove into Meridian for groceries and the mail, and she read it standing at the post office counter because the woman behind the counter, whose name was Pat and who had worked there for 30 years, watched her open it with the expression of someone who already knew what was inside and wanted to see the reaction. Everyone in Meridian knew what was inside. The society had sent similar letters to 3 other people before Gussie, and all 3 had declined, which Pat also knew, and which Gussie learned later that same afternoon from her neighbor Dale, who learned things of this nature approximately 4 hours before anyone else, and whose source was a matter of some local speculation. The letter was straightforward. The 40-year provision in the estate of Celia Thorne had expired on September 4th. The court injunction protecting the property from access had accordingly been lifted. The Pennsylvania Historical Society, as designated custodian of the estate pending final disposition, required a qualified individual to conduct a full inventory of Thornwood Manor and its contents before any decisions regarding the property's future could be made. They were looking for someone with legal training, demonstrated impartiality, and no familial or financial connection to any of the founding families of Meridian. Gussie fit all 3 criteria and had fit them for the 32 years she had lived in this town without ever quite becoming native to it in the way that the people whose grandparents were buried in the Meridian Cemetery were native to it. She called the society's contact number from the post office parking lot and said she would do it, and the woman on the other end of the line said wonderful, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested relief. She spent the following week reading everything she could find about Thornwood Manor and the Thorne family and the coal company that had built Meridian and the families whose names appeared on every street sign and public building in the downtown district. She read the standard histories, first the ones the Historical Society had published in 1976 and 1999, and then she read the newspaper archives from the Meridian Courier, going back to 1890, which the county library had on microfilm, and which Gussie read with the same methodical patience she had brought to case files for 3 decades. What she found in the standard histories was what she expected. Augustus Thorne, visionary. Thorne and Merrick Cole, the engine of regional prosperity. A brief mention of a financial irregularity in 1902 handled swiftly and justly the guilty party. Prosecuted the company stabilized under Augustus's steady leadership. The name Samuel Merrick appeared once in the 1976 history and not at all in the 1999 one. She noted that. On a Monday morning in the first week of October, she drove to Thornwood Hill and parked at the base of the drive. The hill was at its peak, color the maples along the stone wall, gone the deep red that only lasts a few days. And through the trees she could see the roofline of the manor, the round tower at the northeast corner, the widow's walk running the length of the third floor, the chimneys that had not sent smoke into the Pennsylvania sky since 1985. A small group of people had gathered on the far side of the road. She recognized a few of them faces from the hardware store and the diner and the Historical Society's annual fundraiser dinner. At the edge of the group, leaning on a wooden cane, was a man of 85 or so, whom she knew as Howard Crawley, whose grandfather had worked in the Thorn mine, and who attended every town council meeting and had opinions about the founding families that he expressed at length and without invitation. He called out to her as she lifted her bag from the trunk. "Judge Calder. He said it the way people say a title when they want it to carry weight. You certain about this?" She looked at him over the roof of the car. "About the inventory." "About going in there?" He looked up at the house the way people look at things they have been told stories about since childhood. People say Celia Thorne left a curse on the place. Said she'd know if anyone went in before the time was right. Gussie picked up her bag and closed the trunk. "I spent 28 years in a courtroom, Howard," she said. "In all that time, not one curse was ever entered into evidence." She left him on the road and walked up the drive. The gate was iron 10 feet high, the metalwork elaborate in the Victorian fashion vines and leaves worked into the uprights and a monogram at the center that read T and M intertwined, which she understood now stood for Thorne and Merrick both, and had been installed at a time when those two names were still joined. The court-ordered sign on the gate was a laminated rectangle on a metal post. Its text faded to near illegibility, the word restricted still visible, and the year of the original order, 1985, clear enough to read. She unlocked the padlock with the key the society had sent a standard commercial lock that had been installed when the injunction was filed, and which had nothing to do with the original hardware of the gate. The gate itself moved on hinges that had not been oiled in 4 decades and made a sound that caused one of the people on the road to step back involuntarily. Inside the drive was gravel overgrown with 40 years of encroaching grass, the stone walls on both sides buried in ivy, the formal plantings gone entirely to their own devices. She walked up slowly, looking at the house as it came clear through the trees. 3 stories of granite, the stone, the dark gray of Pennsylvania hills, the Romanesque arches over the windows thick and deliberate in the way that very serious money expressed itself in 1885. The south facade was entirely covered in Virginia creeper gone fully crimson, and the effect was extraordinary and also slightly alarming, the house looking as though it were wrapped in something that was very slowly consuming it. She went in through the front door, which opened on the second key attempt, and stood for a moment in the entrance hall while her eyes adjusted. The chandelier above her was crystal, or had been crystal, the pendants now webbed over with a density of dust that had transformed it from something that caught light into something that absorbed it. The staircase of black walnut rose to her left, its condition better than she had expected, the wood dried but intact. On the wall above the landing, at a height that ensured it would be the first thing anyone ascending the stairs would see, was a portrait in oil, approximately 4 feet by 5, its varnish cracked in the fine web pattern that came from a century of temperature change. Augustus Thorne looked down at her from the painting. He had been a large man, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that held authority without apparent effort. He was perhaps 60 in the portrait, which would place it sometime in the 1910s, and he wore the expression she had seen on men of his type throughout her career, the expression of someone accustomed to being the deciding voice in a room. She held his gaze for a moment, then took out her clipboard and began. She worked through the entrance hall, the dining room, the morning room, the kitchen wing, moving methodically and cataloging as she went, filling in the society's numbered form with the flat attention she had given to evidence for 28 years. The house was in better condition than the outside suggested. Celia Thorne had maintained it, or had it maintained through the decades of her residence, and the 40 years of subsequent emptiness had been cold and still, but not catastrophically damp. The furniture remained. The books remained. The kitchen copper had gone entirely green but was structurally intact. She came to the library in the early afternoon. It was the largest room in the house after the entrance hall, running the full depth of the east wing, and it smelled of paper and leather and the particular stillness of rooms where no one has read anything for a very long time. The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, their contents undisturbed, the books still in the arrangements that whoever had last organized them had chosen. At the far end of the room, positioned to receive light from the east windows, was a partner's desk of dark mahogany, its surface bare except for a dried inkwell and a brass lamp with a green glass shade. The desk had belonged to Augustus Thorne. She knew this from the inventory notes the society had prepared from the original estate filing in 1985. This was where he had worked, where he had signed the documents that built the company and the town, where he had sat in the evenings with his accounts and his correspondence. She walked the room's perimeter first, as she had done in every room, looking at the whole before attending to any part of it. The floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, and on the 4th wall, the wall behind the desk, a run of wood, wainscoting from the chair rail to the baseboard. She was about to move on when she stopped. She stood still and looked at the wainscoting again. It was well done. If she had been moving faster, or if she had been looking for something else, or if she had not spent nearly 3 decades developing the habit of noticing when a thing that appeared seamless was not actually seamless, she would have walked past it. The vertical line was barely visible. It ran from the baseboard to the chair rail at a point that did not correspond to any structural logic she could identify. Not a corner, not a door frame, not a natural break in the material. She set her clipboard on the desk and stepped behind it and placed her knuckles against the panel to the right of the line. The sound was not the sound of wood against plaster and lath. She moved her knuckles to the panel on the left of the line. Solid. She went back to the right side panel and knocked again slowly at intervals, moving from the baseboard upward, and each knock came back with the same slight hollowness. She stood straight and looked at the wall and thought about Celia Thorne, who had been 18 years old in 1920 and had lived in this house alone from the death of her father in 1941 until her own death in 1985. A span of 44 years, during which the town of Meridian had called her eccentric and worse, and had looked up at the manor on the hill with the mixture of unease and contempt that towns reserve for people who know things they are not sharing. Gussie reached into her bag and took out the small hammer and the narrow chisel she had packed for the stonework portions of the assessment, and she found the edge of the panel with the chisel's tip and tapped it once lightly. The panel moved. She worked the chisel along the edge, tapping at intervals, and the panel came free in sections, the hidden hinge at the top, and the latch at the bottom, giving way to reveal not plaster and lath behind it, but a cavity in the brick, roughly 18 inches square, sealed with a layer of mortar that had been applied carefully and painted over to match the surrounding wall. She chipped at the mortar with the small hammer, and it came away cleanly dry and sound after more than a century falling in pieces onto the library floor. She put her flashlight into the opening, a ledger dark leather binding its spine uncracked, a bundle of letters bound with a ribbon of silk that had been blue once and was now the color of paper long exposed to air, and beneath them a large envelope of cream stock gone ivory with age. Its flap sealed its surface, addressed in handwriting that was small and precise and entirely steady. She picked up the envelope and held it in the flashlight beam. This is the truth my grandfather never had the courage to speak aloud. If you are reading this, the time has come. Celia Thorne, 1920. Gussie stood in the library of Thornwood Manor with the envelope in both hands and the late afternoon light coming through the east windows across the floor, and the portrait of Augustus Thorne, visible through the open library door at the end of the entrance hall, looking down the length of the house at her. She had read a great many documents in her career. She had learned to recognize the ones that changed the shape of what came before them. This was one of those. She sat in Augustus Thorne's chair. She had not planned to. She had been standing at the desk, the flashlight propped against the inkwell, to give her working light, and she had reached for the nearest chair without looking at it, and only when she was already seated did she register what it was. A leather wing chair, dark burgundy, gone nearly black with age, positioned at the corner of the desk, where a man who worked here would have turned to think. The leather was dry, but uncracked. The frame held firm. She sat in it with the envelope in her lap, and the library quiet around her, and the October light coming flat through the east windows, and she thought for a moment about the particular strangeness of sitting in a dead man's chair inside a house that had been sealed for 40 years to read a letter that a girl had written in 1920 about what she had found in his desk. Then she opened the envelope. There were 3 things inside. She took them out carefully and laid them on the desk in the order they came to hand, the way she had always laid out documents when she needed to understand their relationship to each other before she read any of them in full. The first was a single sheet folded twice the handwriting, small and precise, and not yet fully formed, the handwriting of someone very young, writing with great deliberateness, pressing harder than necessary to keep the letters steady. The second was a document of 12 pages, the paper heavier stock, the handwriting larger and more established, a man's hand, the pen pressure inconsistent in the way it becomes when the person writing is not thinking about the pen. The third was a bundle of 23 letters still tied with a ribbon, their envelopes addressed to 3 different names at 3 different addresses in Meridian. She read the single sheet first. My name is Celia Thorne. I am 18 years old. Last night I found these documents in the locked drawer of my grandfather's desk. I should not have opened that drawer. But I did, and now I have read everything, and I cannot unknow what I know. My grandfather is not the man Meridian believes him to be. He is a coward. In 1901, when the company faced ruin after the mine collapse, he secretly transferred $47,000 from the investment accounts of the Harkness, Drummond, and Whitfield families into the company's operating accounts to keep it solvent. The shortage was discovered in 1902, and instead of confessing, my grandfather allowed Samuel Merrick, his oldest friend, the man who built this company alongside him, from nothing to be made the guilty party. I have read the letters. Harkness, Drummond, and Whitfield gave my grandfather a choice. Either Samuel Merrick would be convicted, or they would withdraw their capital entirely, and Meridian would collapse. My grandfather chose Samuel. Samuel Merrick served 17 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. His wife Cora died while he was incarcerated. His 2 children, Emmett and Florence, grew up without parents. My grandfather lived the remaining 30 years of his life in comfort in this house, but I have heard him most nights crying in this library. I cannot release these documents while I am alive. The 3 families are still too powerful. They would destroy the evidence and destroy me, and the truth would disappear permanently. But I will not allow that to happen. I am going to hide everything in the wall behind this desk in a place that only someone truly looking will find. I will live in this house alone and protect it until I die. And I will write a will with a provision of 40 years, enough time for the 3 families to lose their absolute hold on this town, but not so long that the truth is forgotten entirely. If you are reading this, please finish what I could not. Please tell the Merrick family that Samuel was innocent. And please tell the town of Meridian that Augustus Thorne, their founder, was a coward. But at least in the end, he wrote down the truth. I do not know who you are, but I have been waiting for you my entire life. Celia Thorne, March 15th, 1920. Gussie set the letter down on the desk and sat for a moment without picking up anything else. She had been a judge for 28 years. She had read a great many documents written by people at the extreme edges of what they were capable of, bearing confessions and testimonies and statements given at moments when the person giving them understood that what they said would change things permanently. She had developed over those years a practiced stillness in the presence of such documents, a professional separation between the weight of what she was reading and the functioning of her mind. She found that stillness more difficult to locate than usual. Celia Thorne had been 18 years old, 18, which was the age of the students she sometimes saw at the diner on Friday afternoons after the high school football game, loud and careless with the particular carelessness of people who have not yet had occasion to learn caution. At 18, Celia had opened a locked drawer and found the evidence of her grandfather's betrayal of his best friend, and she had made a decision that would organize the remaining 67 years of her life. She had chosen to wait. She had chosen to stay in the house alone and be called eccentric and difficult and worse, and to protect a wall and to construct a legal instrument that would outlast her, and to trust that eventually someone would come who was not Harkness or Drummond or Whitfield, someone who would be able to do what she could not. 65 years, Gussie thought, from 1920 when she found the documents to 1985 when she died. 65 years of knowing what was in the wall. She picked up the second document. Augustus Thorne had written his confession in the same year his granddaughter had found it, which meant it had been in the locked drawer for approximately 6 months before Celia opened it. He had written it in his own hand across 12 pages of his personal stationery, the letterhead reading A.J. Thorne, Thornwood Manor, Meridian, Pennsylvania, as though he were writing a business letter rather than an account of the worst thing he had ever done. He described the mine collapse of 1901 in specific detail, the number of men trapped, the days of recovery, the financial exposure of the company in the aftermath, the liability claims and the regulatory scrutiny and the hemorrhaging of operating capital. He described the decision to move the funds, which he called in the document a temporary reallocation, and the discovery of the shortage by the three families' auditor the following year. He described the meeting at which Harkness and Drummond and Whitfield had presented him with his choice. He described the trial. He had sat in the witness box and given testimony that was technically true in its individual sentences and collectively amounted to a portrait of Samuel Merrick as the sole decision-maker in the disputed transactions. He had not said Samuel moved the money. He had simply declined to say that he had. He had answered the questions put to him and had volunteered nothing, and had watched Samuel Merrick sentenced to 20 years and had gone home to Thornwood Manor and had lived in it for 31 more years. The final paragraph was 7 sentences long, and Gussie read them twice. I have told myself that I had no choice. I have told myself that if the company had collapsed, Meridian itself would have collapsed, and that the harm of one man's wrongful conviction was less than the harm of an entire town's ruin. I have told myself this for 18 years, and I do not believe it anymore. Samuel Merrick was the best man I knew. He was more honest than I was in every year of our friendship, and I repaid that honesty by allowing him to be destroyed by people who threatened me and whom I was afraid to refuse. I did not commit the original wrong that put him in prison, but I could have stopped it, and I did not. That is sufficient. I am not seeking forgiveness. I am only hoping that this document, which I am too much of a coward to release while I live, will one day be found by someone who is not a coward, and that they will say what I could not. Samuel Merrick was innocent. I knew it. I always knew it. Gussie set the confession on the desk beside Celia's letter and untied the ribbon from the bundle of correspondence. The 23 letters were arranged chronologically, the earliest dated October 1901 and the last April 1903. They were exchanged among Reginald Harkness, Phineas Drummond, and Cornelius Whitfield, written on the headed stationery of the Meridian First Bank, the Drummond Railroad Company, and the Whitfield Steel Works, respectively, and they were written with the directness of men who had been accustomed for a long time to being the people whose correspondence no one would ever question. The first letter established the problem. The fourth proposed the solution. By the 7th letter, the 3 men had agreed on the approach, had identified the auditor they would use, had discussed the particular lines of Augustus Thorne's testimony that would be most useful, and had noted in language so untroubled that Gussie read the passage 3 times to be certain she had understood it correctly, that Samuel Merrick's shares in the company would revert to the partnership upon his conviction, and that these shares divided among the 3 families would represent a satisfactory resolution to the financial exposure created by the original shortage. They had not merely allowed an innocent man to be convicted, they had profited from the conviction. They had used it to acquire the share of the company that Samuel Merrick had spent 20 years building. Gussie laid the last letter on the desk and looked at the 3 stacks of documents in front of her and the open cavity in the wall behind them, and outside the library windows, The afternoon light was going the October sky, turning the gray-orange of early evening, and somewhere in the house a pipe or a shutter or a window frame made a small sound in the cooling air. She was a retired judge. She had no jurisdiction. She had been sent here to count furniture. She thought about Samuel Merrick, who had been convicted in 1902 at the age of 44 and had been released in 1919 at 61, who had gone to Scranton and worked as an accountant for a grocery and died in 1943 at 85, without a word of this ever being said in public, without his name being cleared, without anyone in Meridian ever acknowledging in any official way that what had been done to him had been wrong 123 years. She picked up her phone. She said aloud to the library and to Augustus Thorne's empty chair and to the wall that had held this secret for 105 years, "I need to find whoever is left of the Merrick family." Then she dialed the Pennsylvania Historical Society and began. She spent 3 days in the archive before she drove to Philadelphia. The Lackawanna County Historical Society occupied the second floor of a building on Adams Avenue that had been a bank in a previous life, and the archive room retained the bank's original vault door, now propped permanently open and serving as the entrance to the map collection. The archivist, a man named Theodore, who wore a cardigan in October and would have worn it in July, brought her the first cart of materials without being asked, because she had called ahead, and because Theodore, she gathered, had been waiting for someone to ask for these particular boxes for a very long time. She started with the trial record. The transcript of the 1902 proceedings against Samuel Merrick ran to 240 pages bound in boards that had been green once and were now the color of old grass. She read it in the order it had been produced testimony by testimony, and she made notes in the margins of her yellow legal pad, with the same notations she had used in chambers for 28 years, the shorthand of a person who had learned to move quickly through large amounts of text while missing nothing. The case against Samuel Merrick was not complicated. The prosecution presented the ledger entries showing the transfer of $47,000 from the investment accounts, presented testimony from the company's internal auditor that Samuel Merrick had sole signatory authority over the relevant accounts, and presented the evidence that the funds had been transferred during a period when the prosecution argued Samuel Merrick had been managing the company's accounts without adequate oversight. The defense presented Samuel Merrick's testimony that he had not authorized the transfers and had no knowledge of them. There were no other defense witnesses of consequence. The prosecutor's name was Gilbert Harkness. She checked the date of appointment in the footnotes and found that he had been appointed to the position by the county court in January 1902, 9 months before the trial began. The presiding judge's name was Leonard Whitfield. She wrote both names on her pad and looked at them for a moment. A prosecutor appointed by the brother of Reginald Harkness, a judge who was first cousin to Cornelius Whitfield. Both men dead for decades, both appointments perfectly legal on their face, and in a county where 3 families controlled the significant institutions not even particularly unusual. She read Augustus Thorne's testimony on pages 87 through 104. He had been asked directly whether he had authorized the disputed transfers. He had answered that he had not been the sole officer with authority over those accounts. He had been asked whether Samuel Merrick had authority over those accounts. He had answered that Samuel Merrick had signatory authority, yes. He had been asked whether he had any reason to believe Samuel Merrick had acted improperly. He had answered that he could not speak to Samuel Merrick's intentions. Each answer was technically accurate. Taken together, they pointed in only one direction. She turned to the sentencing record at the back of the volume. Samuel Merrick had been sentenced to 20 years at the Pennsylvania State Penitentiary at Eastern State. He had been 44 years old. He had stood to hear the sentence in a courtroom in Meridian, Pennsylvania, in a building that still stood on the corner of Main and 3rd, and the man who had built a coal company alongside him for 15 years had been sitting in the gallery. She set the trial record aside and asked Theodore for the company transfer documents. The transfer of Samuel Merrick's shares in the Thorne and Merrick Coal Company had been executed on November 14, 1902, 6 weeks after the guilty verdict. The documentation showed a purchase price of $1, recorded as satisfaction of outstanding debt. The shares had been transferred to Augustus Thorne. Within 18 months, the company had been restructured and renamed Thorne Industries, and the three families had each acquired equity stakes at favorable valuations that the documents did not explain in detail. Samuel Merrick had built half a company. He had spent 17 years in prison while the company he built was taken apart and redistributed to the men who had arranged his conviction. She found the 1902 edition of the Meridian Gazette in the bound newspaper volumes and read the coverage of the trial. The headline was large, and its language was not the language of a paper covering a legal proceeding. It was the language of a paper covering a moral event, a fall from grace, a betrayal exposed. Samuel Merrick's name appeared in the first paragraph, modified by words like trusted, disgraced, and guilty. Augustus Thorne's name appeared in the fourth paragraph in a sentence describing his difficult position as the victim of his partner's treachery. She looked at the date on the masthead. The Meridian Gazette's publisher in 1902 was a man named Phineas Drummond, Jr. She spent the next 2 hours with the current town map and the county's street index, working through the named infrastructure of Meridian with a yellow highlighter. Harkness Street, Harkness Bridge, Harkness Community Bank still operating on Main Street under the family name. Drummond Avenue, Drummond Park. 4 acres of green space on the south end of downtown. Drummond Railroad Memorial, a bronze plaque at the old depot. Whitfield Medical Center, the county hospital built in 1954. The Augustus Thorne Memorial Library opened 1961, the largest public building in Meridian, named in a ceremony attended by the sitting governor. She went through the entire index. She used a second color highlighter for anything that carried the Merrick name. She did not need the second highlighter. Theodore brought her one more item without being asked, which told her that he had been thinking about her request and knew what she had not yet asked for. It was a folder of miscellaneous photographs from the 1890s and early 1900s, donated by an anonymous source in the 1970s. He set it on the table and went back to his desk without saying anything. She found the photograph near the bottom of the folder. 2 men standing at the main gate of Thornwood Manor. The gate was the same gate she had opened 3 days earlier. Younger by 30 years, the ironwork bright and new. The men were both in their 30s, both in the formal attire of men who were having their photograph taken in a deliberate way, both looking at the camera with the direct ease of people who are comfortable being looked at. They were standing close together, shoulders nearly touching the way men stand when they have known each other a long time and do not think about the distance. Below the photograph in handwriting on the original mount, a caption: Augustus J. Thorne and Samuel R. Merrick, founders, 1898. She looked at the 2 faces for a long time. In 4 years, one of these men would move $47,000 through the company accounts to save the business. In 4 years, 3 other men would present him with a choice. In 4 years, the man on the right would be standing in a courtroom in Meridian, listening to the man on the left decline to say a word in his defense. She did not know, looking at the photograph, whether Augustus Thorne had known in 1898 what he would do in 1902. She suspected not. She had seen enough human failure in her career to know that most people did not know what they were capable of until the moment they were required to be capable of it. That did not change what he had done. She found Emmett Merrick IV in the records of the Pennsylvania Architects Association, listed at a firm address on Sansom Street in Philadelphia. She found his name in the Philadelphia Business Journal in a short profile from 2019 that described him as a third-generation Pennsylvanian specializing in historic preservation work. It did not mention Meridian. It did not mention Samuel Merrick. She thought about calling. She was on the road before she had fully decided not to. The drive from Meridian to Philadelphia was 3 hours on a clear day, and this was a clear day, the interstate through the Pennsylvania hills in the last of the fall color, and she drove it thinking about what she was going to say to a man who had spent his entire life with a story about his great-grandfather that was entirely false. She parked on Sansom Street and walked to the building and went in through the glass door and introduced herself to the young woman at the reception desk. The young woman asked whether she had an appointment. "No," Gussie said, "but I have something I think Mr. Merrick will want to see." She took the 1898 photograph from the folder she had brought from the archive and set it on the desk face up, the two men at the gate, the caption below. The receptionist looked at the photograph, then at Gussie, then at the photograph again with the slight, careful attention of someone who recognizes a face. Then she picked up the phone and dialed an internal extension. She said, "Mr. Merrick, there is a woman here. She has an old photograph. She says it concerns your great-grandfather. If you want to know what happens when Emmett Merrick IV looks at that photograph, subscribe now. Samuel Merrick was convicted in 1902 and died in 1943 without a word of this ever being corrected. His great-great-grandson has been living with that story his entire life. What comes next will change everything he thought he knew about where he came from." She did not open the briefcase in Ansel Pardo's laboratory until the second morning. The first day she spent in the preparation room watching his graduate students process the materials under his supervision, photograph each document in ordinary light and ultraviolet and infrared, and transfer the images to the analysis workstation. She watched without interfering, which was not difficult for her. She had spent 28 years watching people present evidence and had learned that the most useful thing she could do during that process was be quiet and observe and ask questions only after the presenting party had finished saying what they had to say. Ansel Pardo was 61 years old and had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who understood that conclusions reached quickly were conclusions that did not hold up. He had testified as an expert witness in 14 Pennsylvania court cases and had never been successfully challenged on his methodology. She knew this because she had looked him up before she called him the way she looked up anyone she was about to trust with something that mattered. On the second morning, he called her into the main laboratory and walked her through what they had found. He started with the ledger. The paper was cotton stock with a watermark from the Erie Paper Company of Pittsburgh, a manufacturer that had supplied commercial stationery and accounting materials throughout Pennsylvania from 1880 until the company's closure in 1931. The watermark was consistent with Erie Paper's production from 1898 through 1906. He showed her the watermark under magnification, the faint impressed pattern in the paper that could not be faked without access to the original paper-making equipment. The entries in the ledger were written in iron gall ink of the type in standard commercial use through the early 20th century. He showed her the spectrographic profile on the large monitor, the characteristic curve of iron gall composition, and then overlaid it with the profile from Augustus Thorne's signed correspondence in the county archive documents, whose authenticity was not in question. They matched. He moved to the handwriting comparison. The entry recording the transfer of $47,000 had been written in the same hand as Augustus Thorne's authenticated letters and financial documents. He showed her the comparison on the screen, the original entry on the left, and a letter from 1904 on the right, enlarged to the same scale, and he pointed out the characteristics his analysis had identified. The formation of the capital A, the particular way the pen was lifted between the T and the H in Thorne, the consistent angle of the descenders. The same person wrote both, he said. I would put it at 100%. Augustus Thorne made the entries recording the transfer. He wrote them himself in the company ledger in his own hand. Then the letters? 23 letters, 3 correspondence written over a period of approximately 18 months. He had analyzed each letter's ink separately and found, as she had expected, 3 distinct ink profiles corresponding to 3 distinct writers. Each profile matched the authenticated signatures of Reginald Harkness, Phineas Drummond, and Cornelius Whitfield on business documents in the county archive. All 3 men had written what they had written, and they had written it in their own hands on their own stationery with the confidence of men who were certain no one would ever read it. He set down the last comparison and took off his glasses and set them on the table. He said, I should tell you that I do not say what I am about to say frequently, because what I say in this laboratory is supposed to be limited to what the analysis demonstrates, and nothing else. But the analysis demonstrates this clearly enough that I will say it. Samuel Merrick was convicted of a crime he did not commit. The man who committed it left a written record in the company ledger, and 3 other men planned the framing of an innocent person in letters they wrote to each other over the course of a year and a half. He looked at the documents spread across the table. The only uncertainty, he said, is whether a 120-year-old crime produces any current legal consequence. That is not a question for my laboratory. No, Gussie said. That one is mine. He asked the question that people who understood what she was carrying tended to ask. He said the 3 families still have considerable presence in Lackawanna County. You are aware of that. I am, she said. The descendants did not commit this crime. No, she said. But they have been benefiting from it for 120 years, in the sense that their position in that town was built on a foundation that was partly constructed from what was taken from Samuel Merrick. Whether that creates any legal obligation in 2025 is a more complicated question than what you can answer in this room, and I am not certain I can answer it either. What I know is that the record needs to be corrected, and the people who are owed the correction are still alive. She spent the afternoon organizing the materials into the leather briefcase she had bought the previous day, a plain document case, nothing distinctive about it except what it contained. The ledger, the 23 letters, Celia's letter, Augustus Thorne's confession, Ansel Pardo's full written report, 31 pages, detailed, methodical, signed. She drove to Chestnut Hill in the late afternoon through the old residential streets where the trees were still holding their leaves, the neighborhood brick and leafy and quiet, in the way of parts of Philadelphia that had been prosperous for a long time. The building was a converted row house on Germantown Avenue, 3 stories, well-maintained, the kind of building that housed small professional firms on the lower floors and residences above. The name on the mailbox for apartment 3B was E. Merrick. She rang the bell and waited. The man who opened the door was 44 years old, average height, in a white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up and jeans, and he had the slightly distracted expression of someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something he had been concentrating on. He looked at her with polite uncertainty. She said, "Mr. Merrick, my name is Augusta Calder. I am a retired judge from Lackawanna County. I called your office 2 days ago and your receptionist told me you would be in this evening." He said yes, and she said she had come about his great-grandfather, and something changed in his face at that. Something careful and slightly braced the expression of a person who has grown up carrying a name with a difficult story attached to it, and has learned to receive unexpected contact on that subject with caution. He said, "What about him?" She said, "I have been in Thornwood Manor." She paused. "I found some things in the wall." He looked at the briefcase in her hand. She said, "I think you should sit down." He stepped back from the door and let her in. Emmett Merrick IV had a good apartment. That was the first thing Gussie noticed, not judgmentally but observationally, the way she noticed things. High ceilings, original molding bookshelves built into the alcoves on either side of the fireplace, the books on them organized by size and then within size by some other system she could not immediately determine. The desk in the corner had the organized density of someone who worked at home seriously. On the shelf above it, a framed photograph of a boy of about 12 in a soccer uniform, muddy and grinning, holding a trophy that was too large for him to hold easily. She set the briefcase on the coffee table and sat in the chair he indicated, and he sat across from her on the couch, and she opened the briefcase and took out the materials in the order she had arranged them. She started with Celia's letter. She had thought about this during the drive, about the order in which a person should receive information that was going to change the shape of their history. The forensic report first would have been efficient, but cold, the language of authentication preceding the human story. The ledger first would have been confusing numbers before context. She had decided on Celia's letter because Celia was the one who had understood at 18 what all of it meant, and who had written it down in the plainest language she could manage for a reader she would never meet. She set the letter on the table in front of him in the archival sleeve Ansel's lab had provided and said, "Read this first." He read it carefully. She watched his eyes move through the lines at a pace that told her he was reading every word, not skimming, not looking ahead. When he finished, he looked up at her once briefly, and then looked back down and read it again. Then she placed Augustus Thorne's confession beside it. He read that more slowly. The The confession was 12 pages, and he read all 12, and partway through the 6th page he set it down and pressed both hands flat on his thighs and breathed once deliberately, and then picked it up and continued. Then 3 of the letters chosen because they contain the clearest evidence of the planning, the letter in which Drummond had proposed the approach, the letter in which Whitfield had confirmed the auditor, and the letter in which Harkness had noted in his neat banker's hand that the reversion of Merrick's shares upon conviction would represent a satisfactory resolution. Then the ledger opened to the relevant page the entry for the transfer of $47,000, the column of figures in Augustus Thorne's handwriting, authenticated now beyond any reasonable challenge. Emmett looked at the ledger for a long time without speaking. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the column. He looked at the date. Then he set it down and did not pick up anything else. The apartment was quiet around them. Outside on Germantown Avenue a car passed, and the sound came through the window and faded. He said nothing for a long time. She did not fill the silence. She had learned over many years that silences of this particular kind needed to be inhabited rather than resolved. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He had not made a sound. The tears were simply there the way they arrive sometimes when a person is not performing grief but experiencing it. He said, "My whole life." And then he stopped and started again. Every time someone asked me about my family history, every time someone found out my last name and asked if I was related to the Merrick in Thorne and Merrick, I said yes, and I watched their face, and I knew what they were thinking. And I would change the subject. I never went to Meridian. I never let my son go to Meridian because I did not want anyone to connect us to that name, to what that name meant in that town. He looked at the ledger. "And you are telling me he was innocent?" Gussie said, "Not just innocent. He was the wrong party in every sense the law recognizes, and some it does not. He was betrayed by his closest friend and framed by 3 men who used his conviction to enrich themselves, and he served 17 years and came out and lived the rest of his life with that attached to his name, and never had a single day when the record acknowledged what had actually happened." Emmett stood up and went to the window. She waited. He stood looking out at the street for a while. Then he said, "I have a son." He said his name and then said he is 12. And I have told him the family story, the way I was told it, that Samuel was the black mark, that we did not talk about Meridian, that the Merrick name had something wrong with it that we had to carry. He turned from the window. He said, "What do I tell him now?" Gussie said, "You tell him the truth. You tell him that his great-great-great-grandfather was an honest man who was betrayed by people he trusted, and that the betrayal was buried for 120 years by the people who benefited from it, and that a woman named Celia Thorne spent her entire life making sure the truth survived long enough to be found. And you tell him that his name is not a mark against him. It never was." Emmett sat back down. He looked at the photograph on the shelf above the desk, the boy in the soccer uniform. He said, "I want this public. I want the record corrected. I want his name cleared." Gussie said, "So do I, but I want to do it in the right order." He looked at her. She said the 3 families are still in Meridian. Their descendants did not commit this crime, but they have been living on the foundation it built for 120 years, and they deserve the chance to respond to this evidence before it becomes public, rather than reading about it in a newspaper. That is not a courtesy I extend to everyone. It is a courtesy I extend because I spent 28 years in a courtroom, and I believe that the process by which truth is revealed matters as much as the truth itself. She could see him working with that. She gave him the time to work with it. He said, "And if they refuse to acknowledge it, then the process moves forward without their cooperation," she said. "The documents are authenticated. The historical record is what it is. Their cooperation determines how the correction happens, not whether it happens." 3 days later, she drove back to Meridian, and Emmett Merrick drove up from Philadelphia in his own car, and they met in the parking lot of the old town hall on Main Street on a Tuesday morning in November, the sky flat and gray, and the last of the leaves down, and they walked in together. The town hall meeting room had been used for 140 years for the business of Meridian, the budget hearings and the zoning disputes and the arguments about the school and the debates about the roads, and it smelled of old wood and radiator heat and the specific institutional staleness of a room that had seen a great many things and absorbed all of them. 3 people were already seated on the far side of the long table. Lyndon Harkness was 58 years old and had the composed, watchful bearing of a man who ran a bank and was accustomed to rooms where information determined outcomes. Eleanor Drummond was 55 and sat with her hands folded, the posture of someone who had chaired a great many foundation meetings and understood that the person who controlled their expression controlled the room. Martin Whitfield was 52 and was the only one of the 3 who looked genuinely uncertain, his eyes moving between Gussie and Emmett and the briefcase she was carrying with a restlessness that the other 2 did not display. All 3 of them looked at Emmett. She watched them recognize the name they had been given when she called Merrick and process what it meant that a Merrick was sitting across from them in this room. Gussie set the briefcase on the table. She said, "I found these documents in a wall at Thornwood Manor. I have had them authenticated by a forensics specialist at the University of Pennsylvania. I am going to give each of you the opportunity to read them before we discuss what happens next." She said, "I am telling you this before I tell anyone else because I believe that what happens in this room in the next hour will determine whether Meridian corrects its history with dignity or without it." She opened the briefcase and began to place the documents on the table. For several minutes, no one in the town hall meeting room spoke. The documents lay spread across the long wooden table between them. Celia Thorne's letter, Augustus Thorne's confession, 3 private letters between Harkness, Drummond, and Whitfield, and the ledger page with the transfer of $47,000 written in Augustus's own hand. Gussie did not explain them again. She had learned long ago that there were moments when the truth did not need help. It only needed room. Lyndon Harkness picked up the first letter with 2 fingers as if the paper itself might accuse him if he touched it too firmly. He read the lines once, then again. His expression did not change, but something in his shoulders did. The composed banker's posture softened into something older, something less rehearsed. Across from him, Eleanor Drummond had stopped pretending to manage her face. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, but her eyes moved from Celia's letter to Augustus's confession and back again, as if she were trying to locate the moment where history had turned and no one had ever turned it back. Martin Whitfield was the slowest to read. He read the letters first, then the confession, then the ledger. When he reached the line where his great-grandfather's name appeared beside the transfer, he stopped. Not for a few seconds. For almost a full minute. Outside the tall windows, Drummond Park sat under the pale November light. Children crossed the grass on their way home from school. A woman pushed a stroller along the path. A man in a gray coat walked a dog beneath the statue of Harold Drummond, whose bronze nameplate had been polished so many times it looked almost new. Inside the room, the name Merrick sat on the table like something unearthed. Lyndon Harkness was the first to speak. His voice was quiet, controlled, but not dismissive. "Judge Calder," he said, though Gussie was retired, and everyone in the room knew it, "I did not know about these documents." Gussie said nothing. Lyndon looked down at the confession again. "I did not know my great-grandfather was involved in this." A pause. "But I cannot say I am surprised by the man described here." Eleanor Drummond looked at him. Lyndon continued. "Reginald Harkness was known in our family as practical. That was the word used. Practical with money, practical with risk, practical with men who stood in the way of business." He swallowed once. "I was raised to believe that practicality built this town." His eyes moved toward Emmett. "I was not raised to ask who paid for it." The room went still again. Eleanor Drummond pressed her fingers to her mouth. When she lowered her hand, her voice was unsteady. "Whitfield Hospital, Drummond Park, Harkness Road." She looked through the window at the park carrying her family's name. Every summer benefit, every scholarship dinner, every plaque on every wall. We spoke about generosity as if it began with us. She looked at Emmett then. But it began with what was taken from him. Emmett Merrick IV sat very still. He had been still since Gussie placed the first document on the table. Not stiff, not weak, simply still in the way a man becomes when he knows that if he moves too quickly, something inside him may break before he has finished understanding it. Martin Whitfield finally set the ledger down. The sound of the paper against the table was small, but everyone heard it. "What do we do now?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Then Gussie opened the second folder in front of her. This one did not contain evidence. It contained a proposal. She placed a single page in the center of the table. "We begin," she said, "by giving Samuel Merrick back what can still be returned." Lyndon looked at the page. Gussie continued. "First, the court of Lackawanna County will be petitioned to reopen the 1902 record and issue a formal declaration that Samuel Merrick was wrongfully convicted. The criminal judgment cannot be undone in the way it should have been undone during his lifetime, but the record can be corrected." Emmett's jaw tightened. Gussie saw it, but she did not stop. "Second, the town of Meridian will rename a public place in Samuel Merrick's honor, not to erase the names Harkness, Drummond, or Whitfield from the town. History is not corrected by pretending one wrong name was never there." She looked at all three heirs. "It is corrected by adding the name that was deliberately removed." Eleanor Drummond began to cry then. Quietly, without drama. She looked down, ashamed of her tears, and Gussie understood that they were not tears of injury. They were the tears of a woman realizing that the comfort she had inherited had been built on a silence she had never questioned. Third, Gussie said a bronze plaque will be placed at Thornwood Manor. It will acknowledge Augustus Thorne, yes, but it will also name Samuel Merrick as his partner co-founder and the man whose ruin made the later fortune possible. Martin Whitfield closed his eyes briefly, and fourth, Gussie said the three families will fund a permanent Samuel Merrick scholarship for law students at the University of Pennsylvania. The scholarship will be awarded each year to a student committed to wrongful conviction work, legal ethics, or historical justice. She placed her hand flat on the proposal. Justice delayed cannot be made whole, but it can be made visible. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lyndon Harkness nodded once. "We will do all of it," he said. Eleanor Drummond looked at him. Martin Whitfield looked at Gussie, then at Emmett. Lyndon continued, his voice lower now. "And we will apologize publicly, not on behalf of our great-grandfathers. We cannot apologize for dead men as if we have authority over their souls." He looked at the documents on the table. "But we can apologize for ourselves." He turned to Emmett. "For never asking." Those three words changed the room more than any legal phrase had. For never asking. Not for the forged accusation, not for the stolen shares, not for the 17 years Samuel Merrick had spent carrying a crime that was never his. For the century that followed, for the schools and parks and banks and hospitals that had carried three family names while the fourth name stayed buried, for the descendants who inherited comfort and never once asked why another family had inherited shame. Emmett stood then. Everyone looked at him. He did not raise his voice. "I don't need your apology," he said. Eleanor flinched slightly, but Emmett did not say it cruelly. "My great-great-great-grandfather doesn't need it either. Samuel Merrick died in 1943. Whatever comfort he was owed, he did not receive." He looked toward the window. "My father carried that name like a warning. I carried it like a stain. And my son." He stopped for a moment. "My son is 12 years old. His name is Samuel." Gussie saw Eleanor Drummond put a hand over her heart. Emmett looked back at Lyndon. "My son needs to know that his name is not an embarrassment. He needs to know Samuel Merrick was not the black mark in our family story." His voice held. "He needs to know Samuel Merrick was a good man ruined by bad ones." No one interrupted him. No one should have. When he sat down again, the room felt different, not healed. Gussie did not believe in rooms healing that quickly. But something had shifted. The truth had stopped being a document and had become a duty. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. They discussed the court petition, the town resolution, the plaque language, the scholarship structure, the public statement, the order in which each action should happen so that Samuel Merrick's name would not be thrown into the world as scandal, but restored into it as fact. Gussie wrote notes. Lyndon Harkness made 2 phone calls. Eleanor Drummond asked if the plaque could include a line from Celia Thorne's letter. Martin Whitfield offered to fund the first 5 years of the scholarship immediately. Emmett said little after that. He did not need to. Near the end, when the others began gathering their papers, Lyndon Harkness remained seated. He waited until Eleanor and Martin had stepped into the hallway. Then he rose and came around the table toward Emmett. "Mr. Merrick," he said. Emmett looked at him. Lyndon held himself carefully as if he understood that any wrong word might become another injury. "I know none of this can return 120 years. "No," Emmett said. "It can't." Lyndon nodded. "But there is something else. At Harkness Bank in our archives, we still have a copy of the original certificate of formation for Thorne and Merrick Cole. I didn't know what it meant until today." Gussie looked up. Lyndon continued. "It has both signatures on it, Augustus Thorne and Samuel Merrick, side by side." He paused. "I would like to give it to you." Emmett did not answer. Lyndon added, not as payment, not as apology, just as proof that before they erased him, his name was there. For the first time since they had entered the town hall, Emmett's face changed. Only slightly, but enough. He looked at Gussie. Gussie said nothing. This was not hers to accept. Emmett turned back to Lyndon. "Yes," he said, "I want that." Outside, through the tall windows, Drummond Park lay in the low afternoon light. For more than 100 years, the town had walked through that park beneath the wrong history. Soon there would be another name there, not replacing the old ones, standing beside them. The name that should have been there all along. Samuel Merrick. The petition was filed in Lackawanna County 3 weeks later. Gussie had expected the process to move slowly because courts rarely moved at the speed of feeling. They moved at the speed of paper, filed motions, certified copies, historical records, authentication reports, statements of standing, requests for judicial review. But this time the paper was ready. Celia Thorne's letter, Augustus Thorne's confession, 23 private letters, the forensic authentication from the University of Pennsylvania, and beside her signature was Emmett Merrick IV's. For 123 years, Samuel Merrick's name had existed in the court record as a convicted man. A thief, a fraud, a man who had betrayed his partner and stolen from the company he helped build. That was what the record said. Records have power. Gussie knew that better than most people. She had spent 28 years in courtrooms watching records shape lives, reputations, inheritances, marriages, custody, land businesses, futures. A record could close a door, but sometimes if the truth survived long enough, a record could be opened again. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The courtroom was smaller than Gussie expected. Not grand, not theatrical. No marble pillars, no high balcony. Just a county courtroom with wooden benches, pale walls, an American flag in the corner, and a judge's bench that had seen 100 years of disputes come and go. Judge Deborah Okonkwo presided. She had no family connection to Meridian, no ties to Harkness Bank, Drummond Park, Whitfield Hospital, or Thornwood Manor. That mattered. Gussie had insisted on it quietly, and the court had understood why. Some cases required not only fairness, but the appearance of fairness strong enough to survive the weight of old names. Emmett sat in the front row with his wife on one side and his son on the other. Samuel Merrick VI was 12 years old. He wore a navy jacket that looked slightly uncomfortable on him, the way formal clothes look on boys who would rather be outside. His hair had been combed carefully, his shoes were polished, but his eyes were not the eyes of a child dragged to a ceremony he did not understand. He knew why he was there. His father had told him, not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to know that the name he carried had once been treated like a stain. Enough to know that today a judge might say out loud what no one had said for more than a century. Lyndon Harkness sat 2 rows back. Eleanor Drummond sat beside him. Martin Whitfield sat on the other side. None of them sat in the front row. Gussie noticed that. It was the right choice. For once, their families were not the center of the room. Samuel Merrick was... The hearing itself was brief. The evidence had already done most of the work before anyone entered the courtroom. Judge Okonkwo had reviewed the authenticated documents, the original conviction record from 1902, the newly discovered confession, the ledger, and the correspondence that showed the conspiracy clearly enough that there was no need to dress it up in dramatic language. Truth, Gussie had learned, was often most powerful when stated plainly. Judge Okonkwo looked down at the file before her. Then she looked at Emmett, then at the boy beside him. This court has reviewed the petition submitted regarding the 1902 conviction of Samuel Merrick, she said. The evidence now before this court establishes that the conviction was obtained through fraud, false testimony, and deliberate concealment of material facts. No one moved. Not even the reporters in the back. The documents recovered from Thornwood Manor, including the written confession of Augustus Thorne, the authenticated company ledger, and private correspondence between the men involved in the original prosecution, show that Samuel Merrick was wrongfully accused, wrongfully convicted, and wrongfully deprived of both his liberty and his reputation. Emmett lowered his head. His son reached for his hand. Judge Okonkwo continued. On May 17, 1902, Samuel Merrick was convicted by this court's predecessor institution. Today, 123 years later, this court formally vacates that conviction. The room held its breath. Judge Okonkwo's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Samuel Merrick was innocent. The boy's grip tightened around his father's hand. Emmett closed his eyes. For a moment, he was not a grown man sitting in a courtroom in 2025. He was every Merrick who had changed the subject when asked about Meridian, every Merrick who had carried a name carefully, cautiously, with embarrassment they had inherited but never earned. His wife put her hand on his arm. He bent toward his son and whispered so softly only those nearest him could hear. "You see, our grandfather was a good man." Samuel VI did not answer. He only nodded. But he did not look down. That mattered to Gussie more than the reporters, more than the court order, more than the official seal that would soon be attached to the corrected record. The boy did not look down. By noon, the town of Meridian had gathered in the small square outside the Augustus Thorne Memorial Library. For most of its history, the square had not had an official name. People simply called it the library lawn, or the little park by Thorne, or the place with the old benches. It sat between the library steps and Drummond Park, a modest piece of public ground where children waited for parents. Older men sat with newspapers, and students cut across the grass on the way to school. Now a dark cloth covered a bronze plaque mounted on a low stone base. The mayor spoke first, then Lyndon Harkness, then Eleanor Drummond, then Martin Whitfield. Their speeches were short. Gussie had advised them not to make the day about their shame. Shame, she had told them, had its place, but this was not a ceremony for the guilty. It was a ceremony for the man they had erased. Lyndon said the Harkness family had benefited from a silence it never questioned. Eleanor said public memory was not charity, and no family had the right to decide whose name deserved to survive. Martin said the Whitfield name would help fund the scholarship, but the scholarship would belong to Samuel Merrick's name alone. Then Emmett stepped forward. He did not speak long. He looked at the covered plaque for a moment, then at his son. "My family spent 123 years avoiding this town," he said. "Today my son and I came here carrying the same name my family was taught to hide." He paused. "From this day forward, we will not hide it." He reached down and let Samuel pull the cord. The cloth fell away. The bronze caught the pale afternoon light. Samuel Merrick Square. Samuel Merrick, 1858 to 1943. Co-founder of Meridian's first coal enterprise, wrongfully convicted in 1902, exonerated in 2025. Justice has no expiration date. No one applauded immediately. The silence came first. The kind of silence that means people understand they are standing inside a correction, not a celebration. Then the applause began, soft at first, then steady. Gussie stood behind the front row and looked at the words. Justice has no expiration date. She thought of Celia Thorne. 18 years old, reading papers she was never supposed to read. A young woman understanding the shape of a lie before anyone else was willing to name it. A woman who had spent her life carrying the truth forward in the only way she could. Not by publishing it, not by shouting it, but by protecting it until the day came when it could not be denied. Later that afternoon, a second plaque was placed at Thornwood Manor. This ceremony was smaller. No crowd from town, no podium, no school children, only Gussie Emmett, his family, Lyndon Eleanor Martin, the mayor, and the preservation crew that had helped secure the house after the wall was opened. The plaque was mounted near the front entrance just to the right of the door. It read, "In this house, Augustus Thorne wrote the confession that cleared Samuel Merrick. His granddaughter Celia Thorne preserved that truth inside a hidden wall for 65 years. The documents were discovered by Judge Augusta Calder in 2025. Because of them, Samuel Merrick's name was restored." Gussie read the words twice, the first time as a judge, the second time as a woman who had opened a wall and found another woman's waiting. A reporter approached her as the others moved toward the steps. "Judge Calder," he said, "how does it feel to have helped correct a 123-year-old injustice?" Gussie looked at Thornwood Manor, the old stone facade, the tall windows, the house that had kept its silence longer than most people kept their promises. She took a moment before answering. "I spent 28 years judging the living," she said. "Today I think I helped judge something harder." The reporter waited. Gussie looked at the plaque. "History." The answer would be printed the next day in 3 newspapers. But the moment Gussie remembered most came after the reporters left. Samuel Merrick VI approached her near the front path. He stood with the seriousness of a boy, trying very hard to speak like a man. "Ma'am," he said, "you're the one who found the letters, right?" Gussie smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "I found them." He looked back at the house, at the wall. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for not ignoring it." Gussie felt something in her chest move. Not break, not ache. Move. She lowered herself slightly so that she could look at him directly. "You know, Samuel," she said, "some walls are built to hide the truth." He listened carefully. "But some walls are built to protect it." His eyes moved toward the house again. Celia Thorne's wall was the second kind. The boy nodded slowly. Gussie continued, "When you grow up, remember that. Not everything hidden is hidden out of shame. Sometimes it is hidden because the world is not ready yet, and someone has to keep it safe until it is." Samuel looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I'll remember." And Gussie believed him. By evening, Meridian was quiet again. The courthouse steps were empty. The library lawn had only a few fallen leaves moving in the wind. The new plaque in Samuel Merrick Square had already begun to belong to the place, as if the town itself had been waiting for the correct name to arrive. Gussie returned to Thornwood Manor alone. She let herself in with the key Celia had left through the estate instructions, though Gussie had begun to think of it less as a key and more as an invitation that had taken 40 years to arrive. The house was dim in the late light. She walked past the front hall, past the dining room, past the staircase, and into the library. Celia's room. That was what Gussie had started calling it in her mind, though no one else knew. Not because Celia had slept there, not because it had belonged to her in any formal way, but because this was the room where she had chosen to speak. The section of wall had been opened and carefully framed. The safe inside was empty now. The letters, confession ledger, and every sheet of paper had been transferred to the county archive, cataloged, preserved, and placed where future historians could find them without breaking anything open. But the space remained, a hollow in the wall, a silence that had done its work. Gussie stood before it. For a long time she did nothing. Then she placed one hand against the bricks. "Thank you, Celia," she whispered. The house settled around her old wood, answering the cooling evening. "You waited 65 years. Her voice was almost too quiet to hear, but you did not wait for nothing. She stayed there until the light faded, until the wall became shadow, until the empty safe no longer looked empty to her, but fulfilled. Justice has no expiration date. Gussie had said it once that day. The town would repeat it. The newspapers would print it. But standing alone in Celia's room with her hand against the wall that had protected the truth, Gussie understood something quieter. Justice did not return everything. It did not give Samuel Merrick back his 17 years. It did not give his wife back her husband's unbroken name. It did not give his descendants back the century they spent lowering their eyes. But it gave the next generation something different. A record, a name, a place to stand. And sometimes, after all the years were counted and all the wrongs were named, that was where restoration began. If you believe it is never too late to correct a wrong, take a moment to like this video. Samuel Merrick waited 123 years for the truth to be spoken. And because someone refused to ignore what was hidden in a wall, his name finally came home. 1 year later, Meridian held its 127th Autumn Festival. For most of its history, the festival had belonged to one name, Augustus Thorne. His portrait had hung above the stage every year. His statue had stood at the center of the park since 1935. His name was printed on banners, programs, school essays, library brochures, and the town history pamphlet handed out to visitors who came each October to see the leaves turn gold over the old stone streets. Meridian had always known how to celebrate Augustus Thorne. It had not known what to do with Samuel Merrick. Not at first. A town could correct a record in a courtroom. It could hang a plaque, rename a square print, an apology, and create a scholarship. But public memory did not change in one afternoon. It changed in the small ways people began to speak differently. The first change came quietly. Teachers began saying both names, Thorne and Merrick. At the library, the children's history display added a new panel. At Harkness Bank, near the entrance where customers had walked for generations beneath polished brass and old portraits, a small plaque appeared beside the main doors. It read, "This bank acknowledges that one of Meridian's co-founders, Samuel Merrick, was wronged by the men whose families shaped this institution. We commit to remembering the truth, not only the version that benefited us." Gussie Calder stood in front of that plaque on the morning of the festival and read it twice. Not because the words were complicated, because a public admission was never a small thing, especially from a bank. She was 73 now, though she did not feel 73 in any clear way. Age, she had decided, was less a number than a collection of negotiations, with stairs, with sleep, with memory, with how long a person could stand in one place reading a plaque before the knees began to make their opinions known. She wore a gray coat, sensible shoes, and a blue scarf Celia Thorne had left in a cedar drawer at Thornwood Manor. The scarf had been catalogued with the estate, like everything else, but no one had wanted it. Gussie had asked if she might keep it. No one objected. It felt right to wear it today. She walked from Harkness Bank toward Samuel Merrick Square. Children were playing there. That was the first thing she noticed. Not reporters. Not officials. Not descendants of important families standing stiffly beside speeches. Children! A little girl in a red sweater was chasing her brother around the stone base of the plaque. 2 boys were arguing over a paper bag of roasted chestnuts. A group of teenagers stood near the library steps laughing too loudly at something on a phone. The square had already become ordinary. Gussie found that more moving than ceremony. A name became real when people stopped treating it as fragile. Samuel Merrick Square was no longer only the site of a correction. It was a place where a child could drop a glove, where someone could wait for a ride, where old men could sit in the sun and complain about the weather. That was how a name returned to a town. Not by being whispered with reverence forever, by being used, by being spoken, by being placed on maps, signs, directions, memories. Meet me at Samuel Merrick Square. Turn left after Samuel Merrick. The festival starts at Samuel Merrick. Gussie stood there for a moment listening to the name exist in the world. Then she continued toward the Central Park. The statue had been unveiled that morning before the official festival began. She had not stood in the front row. She had chosen a place near the side beneath a maple tree where she could see without being seen too much. The new statue stood beside the old one. That had been Emmett's request. Not in front, not behind. Beside! Augustus Thorne was still there the way he had stood since 1935, one hand resting on a rolled map, one foot slightly forward face, turned toward the town he had helped build, and the story that had made him larger than he deserved. But now Samuel Merrick stood beside him. Not taller, not triumphant, not carved as a hero who had conquered anything, The sculptor had based the figure on the 1898 photograph Lyndon Harkness had found in the bank archive, the photograph of two young men standing shoulder to shoulder outside the first office of Thorne and Merrick Cole. Samuel's statue stood with his coat open, one hand resting at his side, the other holding a ledger. His face was serious, not stern. He looked like a man thinking about work that still needed to be done. Beneath the two statues, a new inscription had been cut into the stone. 2 friends, 2 founders, 1 truth. Gussie read it slowly. Around her, the festival moved in all directions. A brass band played near the gazebo. Vendors sold cider and apple cakes under striped tents. Children carried paper leaves with both names printed on them. The local high school choir prepared to sing beside the library steps. The festival banner stretched across Main Street. Meridian Autumn Festival, honoring Augustus Thorne and Samuel Merrick. For a moment, Gussie thought of Celia. Not old Celia, not the woman who had died in 1985, not the careful keeper of documents and walls and instructions. Young Celia, 18 years old, standing in a house full of men who believed she would never matter, reading the truth, understanding what it meant, choosing not to let it die. Gussie looked at the statue of Samuel Merrick, then at the blue scarf at her throat. "You did see it," she said quietly. No one heard her. "That was all right." Some sentences were not meant for crowds. Near noon, Emmett Merrick arrived with his family. Gussie saw him before he saw her. He was walking beside his wife, his son, just ahead of them. Samuel VI had grown taller in the past year, as boys do at 12 and 13, suddenly and unevenly, as if they are being pulled upward by a future they do not yet understand. He stopped in front of the statue. He did not speak. His son looked up at the bronze figure of the man whose name he carried. For a long time, father and son stood side by side. Then the boy reached into his jacket pocket and took out something folded, a copy of the original certificate of formation for Thorne and Merrick Cole. Lyndon Harkness had given it to Emmett the month after the hearing. Not the original that remained preserved under glass at the town archive now, but a careful copy framed once, then copied again for the family. On it, the 2 signatures appeared side by side. Augustus Thorne, Samuel Merrick. Before the lie. Before the trial. Before the 17 years. Before the shame. Before generations of Merricks learned to look away from their own name. The boy unfolded the paper and held it up toward the statue as if comparing signature to bronze. Gussie turned away before they could see her watching. There were some moments a family deserved to have without witnesses. She walked toward the library. Inside, the old reading room had been rearranged for the festival exhibit. Glass cases lined the walls. In one case lay Celia's letter, in another Augustus's confession. The ledger was open to the page that had changed everything, though the original was protected now under climate control and soft museum lighting. Beside the ledger was a photograph of the wall safe. Empty. Open! Fulfilled! A group of school children stood in front of the exhibit while their teacher explained the story. Gussie stopped near the doorway. The teacher pointed to Celia's letter. This was written by a young woman who knew the truth was dangerous, she said. She could not fix everything in her lifetime, but she made sure the truth would survive hers. A boy near the front raised his hand. Why didn't she just tell everyone? The teacher paused. It was a good question. Gussie wondered how she would answer it. The teacher said, because sometimes telling the truth is not enough if no one is ready to protect it. Celia protected it until it could be proven. Gussie smiled. That would do. Later in the afternoon, the town gathered near the statue for the formal dedication. The mayor spoke. Lyndon Harkness spoke briefly with no attempt to soften the wrong. Eleanor Drummond read a passage from Celia's letter, her voice steady until the final line. Martin Whitfield announced that the Samuel Merrick Scholarship had received its first 3 applicants. Then Emmett stepped to the microphone. His son stood beside him. Emmett looked out at the crowd, at families who had lived in Meridian for generations, at people whose grandparents had told one version of the story and whose children would now learn another. My family avoided this town for a long time, he said. We thought our name did not belong here. He looked toward the statue. But his name was here before shame was attached to it, before lies were attached to it, before silence was built around it. His son stood very still. Emmett placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. Today, my son can look at a map of Meridian and find our name there. He paused. That may sound small to some people, it is not small to us. No one applauded immediately. As with the unveiling 1 year earlier, the silence came first. Respectful. Heavy. Necessary. Then the applause began. Not loud at first. Then stronger. Gussie did not clap right away. She looked at the inscription beneath the statues and let the moment settle into her. 2 friends, 2 founders, 1 truth. By evening, the festival began to thin. The cider stand closed first, then the school choir folded its risers. Families drifted toward parking lots. Workers took down banners that would be used again next year, now printed with both names permanently because the town council had voted that the change was not ceremonial. It was permanent. Gussie walked one last time through Samuel Merrick Square. The bronze plaque reflected the low amber light of late afternoon. A paper cup had been left near the stone base. She picked it up and carried it to a trash bin because old habits of civic responsibility were not easily retired. Then she looked toward Thornwood Manor on the hill. The house stood above town, its windows catching the last light. A year ago, she had stood in Celia's room with her hand against the open wall, thanking a woman who had waited 65 years. Now the wall was no longer the most important place in the story. That was how it should be. Secrets were not meant to remain sacred forever. They were meant to become truth, and truth once released was meant to leave the room that held it and walk into the world, onto plaques, into court records, into school lessons, into scholarships, into maps, into the mouth of a child saying his own name without shame. Gussie sat on a bench near the square and watched the last families leave. For 28 years she had believed justice lived in courtrooms, in rulings, in evidence, in orders signed and filed and enforced. She still believed that. But not only that, justice also lived in what came after, in whether a town changed its signs, in whether a bank admitted its history, in whether children were taught the corrected name, in whether a family could return to a place it had avoided for more than a century and stand there without lowering its eyes. The church bell rang 6 times. Gussie rose slowly. Before leaving, she walked back once more to the statues. Augustus and Samuel stood together in the dusk, not forgiven, not equal in guilt, not simplified into a comfortable story, but finally placed in the same frame, the way they had been before the betrayal, the way the town should have remembered them. Gussie looked at Samuel Merrick's name carved into the stone. For 123 years it had been a warning. Now it was a direction, a square, a scholarship, a plaque, a statue, a place on the map, and somewhere in a row of preserved documents behind library glass, Celia Thorne's handwriting remained steady across the page, still doing what she had made it do, carrying the truth forward. Gussie adjusted the blue scarf at her throat. Then she turned and walked toward Main Street as the festival lights came on behind her. She did not need to look back to know the name was still there. It would be there tomorrow, and the next autumn, and the autumn after that, long after the people who had gathered today were gone, long after the applause had faded, long after Gussie Calder herself was only a line in some archive. Samuel Merrick's name would remain on the map, and that Gussie thought was how history finally learned to tell the truth.